Chapter 27 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 27. The Conquest. There was no star-storming confidence in Kate Cumberland after that first victory. Rather, she felt as the general who deploys his skirmishers and drives in the outposts of an enemy. The advantage is his, but it has really only served to give him some intimation of the strength of the enemy. At the supper table this night she found Whistling Dan watching her, not openly, for she could never catch his eye, but subtly, secretly. She knew that he was measuring her, studying her, whether in hostility, amity, or mere wonder, she could not tell. Finally a vast uneasiness overtook her, and she turned to the doctor for relief. Dr. Randall Byrne held a singular position in the intention of Kate. Since the night of the fire and her open talk with him, the doctor knew everything, and women are troubled in the presence of a man who knows the details of the past. The shield behind which they hide in social intercourse is a touch of mystery, or at least a hope of mystery. The doctor, however, was not like other men. He was more similar to a precocious child, and she comforted herself in his obvious talent for silence. If he had been alert, strong, self-confident, she might have hated him because he knew so much about her. But when she noted the pale, thoughtful face, the vast forehead outbalancing the other features, and the wistful, uncertain eyes, she felt nothing towards him stronger than pity. It is good for a woman to have something which she may pity, a child, an aged parent, or a house dog. It provides in a way the background against which she acts. So Kate, when in doubt, turned to the doctor, as on this night. There was a certain cruelty in it, for when she smiled at him, the poor doctor became crimson, and when she talked to him, his answers stumbled on his tongue. And when she was silent and merely looked at him, that was the worst of all, for he became unable to manage knife and fork, and would sit crumbling bread and looking frightened. Then he was apt to draw out his glasses and make a move to place them on his nose, but he always caught and checked himself in time, which added to his embarrassment. These small maneuvers had not lasted long before the girl became aware that the silent attention of Whistling Dan had passed from her to the doctor, and held steadily upon him. She did not go so far as to call it jealousy, but certainly it was a grave and serious consideration that measured the doctor up and down and back again, and it left her free to examine the two men in contrast. For the first time it struck her that they were much alike in many ways. Physically, for instance, there was the same slenderness, the same delicacy with which details were finished, the same fragile hands, for instance. The distinction lay in a suggestion of strength and inexhaustible reserve of energy which Dan Barry possessed. The distinction lay still more in their faces. That of Byrne was worn and pallid from the long quest and struggle for truth. The body was feeble, the eyes were uncertain, but within there was a powerful machine which could work infallibly from the small to the large and the large to the small. With Whistling Dan there was no suggestion at all of mental care. She could not imagine him worrying over a problem. His knowledge was not even communicable by words. It was more impalpable than the instinct of a woman, and there was about him the wisdom and the coldness of Black Bart himself. The supper ended too soon for Kate. She had been rallying Randall Byrne, and as soon as he could graciously leave, the poor fellow rose with a crimson face and left the room, and behind him, sauntering apparently in the most casual manner, went Whistling Dan. As for Kate Cumberland, she could not put all the inferences together. She dared not, but when she lay in her bed that night it was a long time before she could sleep, for there was a voice inside her singing. She chose her time the next day. Dan alternated between Black Bart and old Joe Cumberland during most of the day, and no sooner had he left the wolf dog in the morning than she went out to Bart. As always, Black Bart lay with his head flattened against the sand, dreaming in the sun, and not an eyelid quivered when she approached, yet she understood perfectly that the animal knew every move she made. She would have attempted to dress the wound again, but the memory of the ordeal of yesterday was too terrible. She might break down in the midst of her effort, and the first sign of weakness, she knew, was the only spur which Black Bart needed. So she went instead to the chair where Dan often sat for hours near the dog, and there she took her place, folded her hands on her lap, and waited. She had no particular plan in mind, more than that she hoped to familiarize the great brute with the sight of her. Once he had known her well enough, but now he had forgotten all that passed before as completely, no doubt, as Whistling Dan himself had forgotten. While she sat there musing, she remembered a scene that had occurred not many a month before. She had been out walking one fall day, and had gone from the house down past the corrals where a number of cattle newly driven in from the range were penned. They were to be driven off for shipment the next day. A bellowing caught her ear from one of the enclosures, and she saw two bulls standing horn to horn, their heads lowered, and their puffing and snorting breaths knocking up the dust while they pawed the sand back in clouds against their flanks. While she watched, they rushed together, bellowing, and for a moment they swayed back and forth. It was an unequal battle, however, for one of the animals was a hardened veteran, scarred from many a battle on the range, while the other was a young 3-year-old with a body not half so strong as his heart. For a short time he sustained the weight of the larger bull, but eventually his knees buckled and then dropped heavily against the earth. At that the older bull drew back a little and charged again. This time he avoided the long horns of his rival and made the unprotected flank of the animal his target. If he had charged squarely, the horns would have been buried to the head, but striking at an angle, only one of them touched the target and delivered a long, ripping blow. With the blood streaming down his side, the wounded bull made off into a group of cows, and when the victor pursued him closely, he at length turned tail and leaped the low fence, for the corral was a new one, hastily built for the occasion. The conqueror raised his head inside the fence and bellowed his triumph, and outside the fence the other commenced pawing up the sand again, switching his tail across his bleeding side and turning his little red eyes here and there. They fixed at length upon Kate Cumberland, and she remembered with a start of horror that she was wearing a bright red blouse. The next instant the bull was charging. She turned in a hopeless flight. Safety was hundreds of yards away in the house. The skirts tangled about her legs, and behind her the dull impacts of the bull's hoofs swept close and closer. Then she heard a snarl in front, a deep-throated, murderous snarl, and she saw Black Bart racing towards her. He whizzed by her like a black thunderbolt. There was a roar and bellow behind her, and at the same time she stumbled over a fence board and fell upon her knees. But when she cast a glance of terror behind her, she saw the bull lying on its side with lolling tongue and glazing eyes, and the fangs of Black Bart were buried in its throat. When she reached this point in her musing, her glance naturally turned towards the wolf dog, and she started violently when she saw that Bart was slinking towards her, trailing the helpless leg. The moment he felt her eyes upon him, Bart dropped down, motionless, with a wicked baring of his teeth. His eyes closed, and he seemed, as usual, dreaming in the sun. Was the brute stalking her? It was worse in a way than the ordeal of the day before, this stealthy, noiseless approach, and in her panic she first thought of springing from her chair and reaching a distance which the chain would keep him from following. Yet it was very strange. Black Bart, in his wildest days, after Dan brought him to the ranch, had never been prone to wantonly attack human beings. Infringe upon his right, come suddenly upon him, and then, indeed, there was a danger to all saving his master. But this daylight stalking was stranger than words could tell. She forced her eyes to look straight ahead, and sat with a beating heart, waiting. Then, by slow degree, she let her glance travel cautiously back towards Bart without turning her head. There was no doubt about it. The great wolf dog was slinking towards her on his belly, still trailing the wounded foreleg. There was something snake-like in that slow approach, so silent and so gradual. And yet she waited, moving neither hand nor foot. A sort of nightmare paralysis held her, as when we flee from some horror in our dreams and find that our limbs have grown numb. Behind us races the deadly thing, closer and closer. Before us is the door of safety, only a step to reach it, and yet we cannot move a foot. It was not all pure terror. There was an incredible excitement as well, her will against the will of the dumb brute. Which would conquer? She heard a faint rustling of the sand beside her, and could hardly keep from turning her head again. But she succeeded. Waves of coldness broke on her mind. Her whole body would have shuddered had not fear chilled her into motionlessness. All reason told her that it was madness to sit there with the stealthy horror sliding closer. Even now it might be too late. If she rose, the shaggy form might spring from the ground at her. Perhaps the wolf had treasured up the pain from the day before, and now... A black form did, indeed, rise from the ground, but slowly. And standing on three legs, Bart stood a moment and stared in the face of the girl. The fear rushed out of her heart, and her face flushed hotly with relief. There was no enmity in the steady stare of the wolf dog. She could feel that even though she did not look, something that Whistling Dan had said long before came to her. Even a hoss and a dog, Kate, can get terrible lonesome. Black Bart moved until he faced her directly. His ears were pricking in eagerness. She heard a snarl, but so low and muffled that there was hardly a threat in it. Could it be a plea for attention? She would not look down to the sharp eyes until a weight fell on her knees. It was the long, scarred head of the wolf. The joy that swelled in her was so great that it pained her like a grief. She stretched out her hands slowly, slowly towards that head, and Black Bart shrank and quivered, and his lips withered back from the long, deadly teeth, and his snarl grew to a harsher, hoarser threat. Still he did not remove his head, and he allowed the hand to touch him between the eyes and stroke the fur back to between the ears. Only one other hand had ever touched that formidable head in such a manner. The teeth no longer showed. The keen, suspicious eyes grew dim with pleasure. The snarl sank to murmur and then died out. "Bart!" commanded the girl sharply. The head jerked up, but the questioning eyes did not look at her. He glanced over his shoulder to find the danger that had made her voice so hard, and she yearned to take the fierce head in her arms. There were tears she could have wept over it. He was snarling again, prepared already to battle, and for her sake. "Bart," she repeated more gently, "lie down." He turned his head slowly back to her and looked with that unspeakable wistfulness of the dumb brutes into her eyes. But there was only one voice in which Bart could speak, and that was the harsh, rattling snarl which would have made a mountain lion check itself mid-leap and slink back to its lair. In such a voice he answered Kate, and then sank down gradually, and he lay still. So simply and yet so mysteriously she was admitted to the partnership. But though one member of that swift, grim trio had accepted her, did it mean that the other two would take her in? A weight sank on her feet, and when she looked down she saw that Black Bart had lowered his head upon them, and so he lay there with his eyes closed, dreaming in the sun. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand, Chapter 28, The Trail. Bandages and antiseptics and constant care by themselves could not have healed Black Bart so swiftly, but nature took a strong hand. The wound closed with miraculous speed. 3 days after he had laid his head on the feet of Kate Cumberland, the wolf dog was hobbling about on 3 legs and tugging now and again at the restraining chain. And the day after that, the bandages were taken off, and Whistling Dan decided that Bart might run loose. It was a brief ceremony, but a vital one. Dr. Byrne went out with Barry to watch the loosening of the dog. From the window of Joe Cumberland's room, he and Kate observed what passed. There was little hesitancy in Black Bart. He merely paused to sniff the foot of Randall Byrne, snarl, and then trotted with a limp towards the corral. Here, in a small enclosure, with rails much higher than the other corrals, stood Satan, and Black Bart made straight for the stallion. He was seen from afar, and the black horse stood waiting, his head thrown high in the air, his ears pricking forward, the tail flaunting, a picture of expectancy. So under the lower rail Bart slunk and stood under the head of Satan, growling terribly. Of this display of anger the stallion took not the slightest notice, but lowered his beautiful head until his velvet nose touched the cold muzzle of Bart. There was something ludicrous about the greeting. It was such an odd shade close to the human. It was as brief as it was strange, for Black Bart at once whirled and trotted away towards the barns. By the time Dr. Byrne and Whistling Dan caught up with him, the wolf dog was before the heaps and ashes which marked the site of the burned barn. Among these white and gray and black heaps he picked his way, sniffing hastily here and there. In the very center of the place he sat down suddenly on his haunches, pointed his nose aloft, and wailed with tremendous dreariness. "Now," murmured the doctor to Dan, "that strikes me as a singular manifestation of intelligence in an animal. He has found the site of the very barn where he was hurt. Upon my word, even fire doesn't affect his memory." Here he observed that the face of Whistling Dan had grown grim. He ran to Bart and crouched beside him, muttering, and Byrne heard. "That's about where you was lying," said Dan, "and you smell your own blood on the ground. Keep trying, Bart. There's something else to find around here." The wolf dog looked his master full in the face with prickling ears, whined, and then started off, sniffing busily at the heaps of ashes. "The shooting of the dog is quite a mystery," said Byrne, by way of conversation. "Do you suppose that one of the men from the bunkhouse could have shot him?" But Dan seemed no longer aware of the doctor's presence. He slipped here and there with the wolf dog among the ash heaps, pausing when Bart paused, talking to the brute continually. Sometimes he pointed out to Bart things which the doctor did not perceive, and Bart whined with a terrible, slavering, blood eagerness. The wolf dog suddenly left the ash heaps, and now darted in swiftly entangled lines here and there among the barns. Dan Barry stood thoughtfully still, but now and then he called a word of encouragement. And Black Bart stayed with his work. Now he struck out a wide circle, running always with his nose close to the ground. Again he doubled back sharply to the barn site, and began again in a new direction. He ran swiftly, sometimes putting his injured leg to the ground with hardly a limp, and again drawing it up and running on 3 feet. In a moment he passed out of sight behind a slight rise of ground to the left of the ash heaps, and at some little distance. He did not reappear. Instead, a long, shrill wail came wavering toward the doctor and Dan Barry. It raised the hair on the head of the doctor and sent a chill through his veins, but it sent Whistling Dan racing towards the place behind which Black Bart had disappeared. The doctor hurried after as fast as he might, and came upon the wolf dog making small, swift circles, his nose to the ground, and then crossing to and fro out of the circle. And the face of the master was black while he watched. He ran again to Bart and began talking swiftly. "D'ye see?" he asked, pointing. "From behind this here hill you could get a pretty good sight of the barn, and you wouldn't be seen, hardly, from the barn. Someone must have waited here. Look about, Bart. You'll be finding a pile of signs around here. It means that them that done the shootin' and the firin' of the barn stood right here behind this hilltop and watched the barn burn, and was hopin' that Satan and you wouldn't never come out alive. That's the story." He dropped to his knees and caught Bart as the big dog ran by. "Find 'em, Bart," he whispered. "Find 'em." And he struck sharply on the scar where the bullet had ploughed its way into Bart's flesh. The answer of Bart was a yelp too sharp and too highly pitched to have come from the throat of any mere dog. Once more he darted out and ran here and there, and Doctor Byrne heard the beast moaning as it ran. Then Bart ceased circling and cut down the slope away from the hill at a sharp trot. A cry of inarticulate joy burst from Dan, and then, "You've found it! You have it!" And the master ran swiftly after the dog. He followed the latter only for a short distance down the slope, and then stood still and whistled. He had to repeat the call before the dog turned and ran back to his master, where he whined eagerly about the man's feet. There was something uncanny and horrible about it. It was as if the dumb beast was asking for a life, and the life of a man. The doctor turned back and walked thoughtfully to the house. At the door he was met by Kate and a burst of eager questions, and he told simply all that he had seen. "You'll get the details from Mr. Barry," he concluded. "I know the details," answered the girl. "He's found the trail, and he knows where it points now, and he'll want to be following it before many hours have passed. Dr. Byrne, I need you now terribly. You must convince Dan that if he leaves us it will be a positive danger to Dad. Can you do that?" "At least," said the doctor, "there will be little deception in that. I will do what I can to persuade him to stay." "Then," she said hurriedly, "sit here, and I shall sit here. We'll meet Dan together when he comes in." They had hardly taken their places when Barry entered, the wolf at his heels. At the door he paused to flash a glance at them, and then crossed the room. On the farther side he stopped again. "I might be telling you," he said in his soft voice, "that now Bart's got well, I got to be travelling again. I start in the morning." The pleading eyes of Kate raised Byrne to his feet. "My dear Mr. Barry," he called. The other turned again and waited. "Do you mean that you will leave us while Mr. Cumberland is in this critical condition?" A shadow crossed the face of Barry. "I'd stay if I could," he answered, "but it ain't possible." "What takes you away is your affair, sir," said the doctor. "My concern is Mr. Cumberland. He is in a very precarious condition. The slightest nerve shock may have fatal results." Dan Barry sighed. "Seems to me," he answered, "that he was bucking up considerable. Don't look so thin, Doc." "His body may be well enough," said the doctor calmly, "but his nerves are wrecked. I'm afraid to prophesy the consequences if you leave him." It was apparent that a great struggle was going on in Barry. He answered at length: "How long would I have to stay? One rain could wipe out all the sign and make me like a blind man in the desert. Doc, how long would I have to stay?" "A few days," answered Byrne, "may work wonders with him." "I'll go up and talk with him," he said, "and what he wants I'll do." Chapter 28. Chapter 29 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 29. Talk. He was long in getting his answer. The hours dragged on slowly for Kate and the doctor, for if Joe Cumberland could hold Dan, it was everything to the girl, and if Barry left at once, there might be some root for the hope which was growing stronger and stronger every day in the heart of Randall Byrne. Before evening a not unwelcome diversion broke the suspense somewhat. It was the arrival of no less a person than Marshal Jeff Calkins. His shoulders were humped, and his short legs bowed from continual riding, and his head was slung far forward on a gaunt neck, so that when he turned his head from one to another in speaking, it was with a peculiar pendulum motion. The marshal had a reputation which was strong over the 300 miles and more of a mountain desert. This was strange, for the marshal was a very talkative man, and talkative men are not popular on the desert, but it has been discovered that on occasion his six-gun could speak as rapidly and much more accurately than his tongue, so Marshal Calkins waxed in favor. He set the household at ease upon his arrival by announcing that they had nothing for him there. All he wanted was a place to bunk in, some chow, and feed for the horse. His trail led past the Cumberland ranch many and many a dreary mile. The marshal was a politic man, and he had early in life discovered that the best way to get along with any man was to meet him on his own ground. His opening blast of words at Dr. Byrne was a sample of his art. "So you're a doc, eh? Well, sir, when I was a kid I had a colt that stuck its foreleg in a hole and busted it short, and when that colt had to be shot there was no holding me. No, sir, I could have cleaned up on the whole family. And ever since then I've had a hankering to be a doc. Something about the idea of cutting into a man that always sort of tickled me. There's only one main thing that holds me back. I don't like the idea of knifing a feller when he ain't got a chance to fight back." To this Dr. Randall Byrne bowed, rather dazed, but returned no answer. "And how's your patient, Doc?" pursued the irresistible marshal. "How's old Joe Cumberland? I remember when me and Joe used to trot about the range together. I was sort of a kid then. But think of old Joe being down in bed, sick. Why, I ain't never been sick a day in my life. Sick? I'd laugh myself plumb to death if anybody ever wanted me to go to bed. What's the matter with him, anyway?" "His nerves are a bit shaken about," responded the doctor, "to which I might add that there is superimposed an arterial condition." "Cut it short, Doc," cried the marshal good-naturedly. "I ain't got a dictionary handy. Nerves bad, eh? Well, I don't wonder about that. The old man's had enough trouble lately to make anybody nervous. I wouldn't like to go through it myself, no sir, what with that Dan Barry. I ain't stepping on any corns, Kate, am I?" She smiled vaguely, but the marshal accepted the smile as a strong dissent. "There was a time not long ago when folks said that you was kind of sweet on Dan. Glad to hear there ain't nothing in it. 'S a matter of fact—" But here Kate interrupted with a raised hand. She said: "I think that was the supper gong. Yes, there it is. We'll go in now, if you wish." "There's only one sound in the world that's better to me than a dinner gong," said the profuse marshal, as they seated themselves around the big dining room table, "and that was the sound of my wife's voice when she said 'I will.' Queer thing, too. Maria ain't got a very soft voice, most generally speaking, but when she busted up in front of that preacher and says 'I will,' why, God Almighty, asking your pardon, Kate, there was a change come in her voice that was like a bell chiming down in her throat, a bell ringing away off far, you know, so you only kind of guess at it. But coming back to you and Dan, Kate." It was in vain she plied the marshal with edibles. His tongue wagged upon roller bearings and knew no stopping. Moreover, the marshal had spent some portion of his life in a boarding house and had mastered the boarding house art of talking while he ate. "Coming back to you and Dan, we was all of us saying that you and Dan kind of had an eye for each other. I suppose we was all wrong. You see, That was back in the days before Dan busted loose. When he was about the range, most usually he was the quietest man I ever sat opposite to, barrin' one, and that was a feller that went west with a bum heart at the chuck table. Ha, ha, ha! The marshal's laughter boomed through the big room as he recalled this delightful anecdote. He went on, "But after that Jim Silent play we all changed our minds some. Do you know, Doc, I was in Elkhead the night that Dan got our Lee Haines." "I've never heard of the episode," murmured the doctor. "You ain't? Well, I'll be damned, askin' your pardon, Kate, but you sure ain't lived in these parts long. Which you wouldn't think one man could ride into a whole town, go to the jail, knock out 2 guards that was proved men, take the keys, unlock the irons off the man he wanted, saddle a hoss, and ride through a whole town full of folks that was shootin' at him. Now would you think that was possible?" "Certainly not." "And it ain't possible, I'm here to state. But they was something different about Dan Barry. Did you ever notice it, Kate?" She was far past speech. "No, I guess you never would have noticed it. You was livin' too close to him all the time to see how different he was from other fellers. Anyway, he done it. They say he got plugged while he was riding through the lines, and he bled all the way home, and he got there unconscious. Is that right, Kate?" He waited an instant and then accepted the silence as an affirmative. "Funny thing about that, too. The place where he come to was Buck Daniels' house. Well, Buck was one of Jim Silent's men, and they say Buck had tried to plug Dan before that, but Dan let him go that time, and when Buck seen Dan ride in all covered with blood, he remembered that favour, and he kept Dan safe from Jim Silent and safe from the law until Dan was well. I seen Buck this morning over to Rafferty's place, and—" Here the marshal noted a singular look in the eyes of Kate Cumberland, a look so singular that he turned in his chair to follow it. He saw Dan Barry in the act of closing the door behind him, and Marshal Calkins turned a deep and violent red, varied instantly by a blotchy yellow, which in turn faded to something as near white as his tan permitted. "Dan Barry!" gasped the marshal, rising, and he reached automatically towards his hips before he remembered that he had laid his belt and guns aside before he entered the dining room, as etiquette is in the mountain desert, for it is held that shooting at the table disturbs the appetite. "Good evening," said Dan quietly. "Was it Buck Daniels that you seen at Rafferty's place, Marshal Calkins?" "Him," nodded the marshal hoarsely. "Yep, Buck Daniels." And then he sank into his chair, silent for the first time. His eyes followed Barry as though hypnotized. "I'm kind of glad to know where I can find him," said Barry, and took his place at the table. The silence continued for a while, with all eyes focused on the newcomer. It was the doctor who had to speak first. "You talked things over with Mr. Cumberland?" he asked. "We had a long talk," nodded Dan. "You was wrong about him, Doc. He thinks he can do without me." "What?" cried Kate. "He thinks he can do without me," said Dan Barry. "We talked it all over." The silence fell again. Kate Cumberland was staring blankly down at her plate, seeing nothing, and Doctor Byrne looked straight before him and felt his pulse drumming in his throat. His chance then was to come. By this time the marshal had recovered his breath. He said to Dan, "Seems like you been away some time, Dan. Where you been hanging out?" "I've been riding about," answered Dan vaguely. "Well," chuckled the marshal, "I'm glad there ain't no more Jim Silents about these parts, not while you're here and while I'm here. You kept things kind of busy for Glasgow, Dan." He turned to Kate, who had pushed back her chair. "What's the matter, Kate?" he boomed. "You ain't looking too tip-top sick." "I may be back in a moment," said the girl, "but don't delay supper for me." She went out of the room with a step poised well enough, but the moment the door closed behind her she fairly staggered to the nearest chair and sank into it, her head fallen back, her eyes dim, and all the strength gone from her body and her will. Several minutes passed before she roused herself, and then it was to drag herself slowly up the stairs to the door of her father's room. She opened it without knocking, and then closed it and stood with her back against it, in the shadow. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 30. The Voice of Black Bart. Her father lay propped high with pillows, among which his head lolled back. The only light in the room was near the bed, and it cast a glow upon the face of Joe Cumberland, and on the white linen, the white hair, the white pointed beard. All the rest of the room swam in darkness. The chairs were blotches, indistinct, uncertain. Even the foot of the bed trailed off to nothingness. It was like one of those impressionistic, very modern paintings, where the artist centers upon one point and throws the rest of his canvas into dull oblivion. The focus here was the face of the old cattleman. The bedclothes, never stirred, lay in folds sharply cut out with black shadows, and they had a solid seeming, as the mort cloth rendered in marble over the effigy. That suggested weight exaggerated the frailty of the body beneath the clothes. Exhausted by that burden, the old man lay in the arms of a deadly languor, so that there was a kinship of more than blood between him and Kate at this moment. She stepped to the side of the bed and stood staring down at him, and there was little gentleness in her expression. So cold was that settled gaze that her father stirred at length, shivered, and without opening his eyes, fumbled at the bedspread and drew it a little more closely about his shoulders. Even that did not give him rest. Presently the wrinkled eyelids opened, and he looked up at his daughter. A film of weariness, heavier than sleep, at first obscured his sight, but this in turn cleared away. He frowned a little to clear his vision, and then wagged his head slowly from side to side. "Kate," he said feebly, "I done my best. It simply wasn't good enough." She answered in a voice as low as his, but steadier. "What could have happened? Dad? What happened to make you give up every hold on Dan? What was it? You were the last power that could keep him here. You knew it. Why did you tell him he could go?" The monotone was more deadly than any emphasis of a raised word. "If you'd been here," pleaded Joe Cumberland, "you'd have done what I done. I couldn't help it. There he sat at the foot of the bed. See where them covers still kind of sagged down. After he told me that he had something to do away from the ranch, and that he wanted to go now that Black Bart was well enough to travel in short spells, he asked me if I still needed him." "And you told him no?" she cried. "Oh, Dad, you know it means everything to me. But you told him no." He raised a shaking hand to ward off the outburst and stop it. "Not at first, honey. Give me a chance to talk, Kate. At first I told him that I needed him, and God knows that I do need him. I don't know why. Not even Dr. Byrne knows what there is about Dan that helps me. I told Dan all them things, and he didn't say nothing, but just sat still on the foot of the bed and looked at me. It ain't easy to bear his eyes, Kate. I lay here and tried at first to smile at him and talk about other things, but it ain't easy to bear his eyes. You take a dog, Kate. It ain't supposed to be able to look you in the eyes for long. But suppose you met up with a dog that could. It'd make you feel sort of queer inside, which I felt that way while Dan was looking at me. Not that he was threatening me. No, it wasn't that. He was only thoughtful, but I kept getting more nervous and more fidgety. I felt after a while like I couldn't stand it. I had to crawl out of bed and began walking up and down till I got quieter. But I seen that wouldn't do. Then I begun to think. I thought of near everything in a little while. I thought of what would happen. Suppose Dan should stay here. Maybe you and him would get to like each other again. Maybe you'd get married. Then what would happen?
I thought of the wild geese flying north in the spring of the year, and the wild geese flying south in the fall of the year, and I thought of Dan with his heart following the wild geese, God knows why, and I seen a picture of him standing and watching them, with you near by, and not able to get one look out of him. I seen that, and it made my blood chilly, like the air on a frosty night. Kate, there's something like the power of prophecy that comes to a dying man." "Dad," she cried, "what are you saying?" She slipped to her knees beside the bed and drew his cold hands toward her, but Joe Cumberland shook his head and mildly drew one hand away. He raised it with extended forefinger, a sign of infinite warning, and with the glow of the lamp full upon his face, the eyes were pits of shadow, with stirring orbs of fire in the depths. "No, I ain't dead now," he said, "but I ain't far away from it. Maybe days, maybe weeks, maybe whole months, but I've passed the top of the hill, and I know I'm riding down the slope. Pretty soon I'll finish the trail, but what little time I've got left is worth more than everything that went before. I can see my life behind me, and the things before like a cold morning light was over it all. You know, before the sun begins to beat up the waves of heat and the mist gets tangling in front of your eyes. You know, when you can look right across a 30-mile valley and name the trees most on the other side. That's the way I can see now. There ain't no feeling about it. My body is all plumb paralyzed. I just see and know. That's all. And what I see of you and Dan, if you ever marry, is plain hell. Love ain't the only thing that is between a man and a woman. There's something else. I don't know what it is, but it's sort of a common purpose. It's having both pairs of feet stepping out on the same path. That's what it is. But your trail would go one way and Dan's would go another, and pretty soon your love wouldn't be nothing but a big wind blowing between two mountains, and all it would do would be to freeze up the blood in your hearts. I seen all that while Dan was sitting at the foot of the bed. Not that I don't want him here. When I see him I see the world the way it was when I was under 30, when there wasn't nothing I wouldn't try once, when all I wanted was a gun and a hoss and a song to keep me from trading with kings. No, it ain't going to be easy for me when Dan goes away. But what's my tag end of life compared with yours? You've got to be given a chance. You've got to be kept away from Dan. That's why I told him, finally, that I thought I could get along without him." "Whether or not you saved me," she answered, "you signed the death warrant for at least 2 men when you told him that." "2 men? They's only one he's after, and Buck Daniels has had a long start. He can't be caught." "That Marshal Calkins is here tonight. He saw Buck at Rafferty's, and he talked about it in the hearing of Dan at the table. I watched Dan's face. You may read the past and see the future, Dad, but I know Dan's face. I can read it as a sailor reads the sea. Before tomorrow night Buck Daniels will be dead, and Dan's hands will be red." She dropped her head against the bedclothes and clasped her fingers over the bright hair. When she could speak again she raised her head and went on in the same swift, low monotone. "And besides, Black Bart has found the trail of the man who fired the barn and shot him, and the body of Buck won't be cold before Dan will be on the heels of the other man. Oh, Dad, 2 lives lay in the hollow of your hand. You could have saved them by merely asking Dan to stay with you, but you've thrown them away." "Buck Daniels," repeated the old man, the horror of the thing dawning on him slowly. "Why didn't he get farther away? Why didn't he ride night and day after he left us? He's got to be warned that Dan is coming." "I've thought of that. I'm going into my room now to write a note and send it to Buck by one of our men. But at the most he'll have less than a day's start, and what is a day to Satan and Dan Barry?" "I thought it was for the best," muttered old Joe. "I couldn't see how it was wrong. But I can send for Dan and tell him that I've changed my mind." He broke off in a groan. "No, that wouldn't be no good. He's set his mind on going by this time, and nothing can keep him back. But, Kate, maybe I can delay him. Has he gone up to his room yet?" "He's there now. Talk softly, or he'll hear us. He's walking up and down now." "Aye," nodded old Joe, his eyes widening with horror. "And his footfalls is like the padding of a big cat. I could tell it out of 1,000 steps. And I know what's going on inside his mind. Yes, he's thinking of the blow Buck Daniels struck him. He's thinking of the man who shot down Bart. God save them both." "Listen," whispered the cattleman. "He's raised the window. I heard the rattle of the weights. He's standing there in front of the window, letting the wind of the night blow in his face." The wind from the window, indeed, struck against the door communicating with Joe Cumberland's room, and shook it as if a hand were rattling at the knob. The girl began to speak again, as swiftly as before, her voice the barely audible rushing of a whisper. "The law will trail him, but I won't give him up. Dad, I'm going to fight once more to keep him here. And if I fail, I'll follow him around the world." Such words should have come loudly, ringing. Spoken so softly, they gave a terrible effect, like the ravings of delirium or the monotone of insanity. And with the white light against her face, she was more awe-inspiring than beautiful. "He loved me once, and the fire must still be in him. Such fire can't go out, and I'll fan it back to life, and then, if it burns me, if it burns us both, the fire itself cannot be more torture than to live on like this." "Hush, lass," murmured her father. "Listen to what's coming." It was a moan, very low-pitched, and then rising slowly and gaining in volume, rising up the scale with a dizzying speed till it burst and rang through the house. The long drawn wail of a wolf when it hunts on a fresh trail. End of chapter 30.
Chapter 26 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 26. The Battle. The chain which fastened Black Bart had been passed around the trunk of a tree that stood behind the ranch house, and there the great dog lay, tethered. Dr. Byrne had told Whistling Dan, with some degree of horror, that the open air was in the highest degree dangerous to wounds, but Whistling Dan had returned no answer. So Black Bart lay all day in the soft stand, easing himself from time to time into a new position, and his thoughtful eyes seemed to be concentrated on the desire to grow well. Beside him was the chair in which Dan Barry sat for many an hour of the day and even the night. Kate Cumberland watched the animal from the shadow of the house. His eyes were closed, and the long, powerful head lay inert on the sand, yet she knew that the wolf dog was perfectly aware of her presence. Day after day since he lay there, she had attempted to approach Black Bart, and day after day he had allowed her to come within reaching distance of him, only to drive her back at the last moment by a sudden display of the murderous long fangs, or by one of those snarls which came out of the black depths of its heart. Now a dog snarls from not far down in its throat, but the noise of an angered wild beast rolls up out of its very entrails, a passion of hate and defiance. And when she heard that sound, or when she saw the still more terrible silent rage of the beast, Kate Cumberland's spirit failed, and she would shrink back again to a safe distance. She was not easily discouraged. She had that grim resolution which comes to the gambler after he has played at the same table night after night, night after night, and lost, until, playing with the last of his money, he begins to mutter through his set teeth, "The luck must change." So it was with Kate Cumberland, for in Black Bart she saw the only possible clue to Whistling Dan. There was the stallion, to be sure, but she knew Satan too well. Nothing in the wide world could induce that wild heart to accept more than one master, more than one friend. For Satan there was in the animal world Black Bart, and in the world of men Dan Barry. These were enough. For all the rest he kept the disdainful speed of his slender legs or the terror of his teeth and trampling hoofs. Even if she could have induced the stallion to eat from her hand, she could never have made him willing to trust himself to her guidance. Some such thing she felt she must accomplish with Black Bart. To the wild beast with the scarred and shaggy head she must become a necessary, an accepted thing. One repulse did not dishearten her. Again and again she made the trial. She remembered having read that no animal can resist the thoughtful patience of thinking man, and hour after hour she was there until a new light in the eye of the wolf dog warned her that the true master was coming. Then she fled, and from a post of vantage in the house she would watch the two. An intimacy surpassing the friendships and devotions of human beings existed between them. She had seen the wolf lie with its great head on the foot of his master, and the unchanging eyes fixed on Barry's face, and so for an hour at a stretch in mute worship. Or she had watched the master go to the great beast to change the dressing, a thing which could not be done too often during the day. She had seen the swift hands remove the bandages, and she had seen the cleansing solution applied. She knew what it was. It stung even the unscratched skin, and to a wound it must be torture. But the wolf lay and endured, not even shuddering at the pain. It had seemed to her that this was the great test. If she could make the wolf lie like this for her, then, truly, she might feel herself in some measure admitted to that mystic fellowship of the three, the man, the stallion, and the wolf. If she could, with her own unaided hands, remove the bandages and apply that solution, then she could know many things, and she could feel that she was nearer to Whistling Dan than ever before. So she had come time and again with the basin and the roll of cloth in her arm, and she had approached with infinite patience, step by step, and then inch by inch. Once it had taken a whole hour for her to come within a yard of the beast, and all that time Black Bart had lain with closed eyes. But at that critical instant always, there was that silent writhing up of the lips, and the gleam of hate, or the terrible snarl while the eyes fastened on her throat. Her heart had stopped in mid-beat, and that day she ran back into the house and threw herself on her bed, and would not come from her room till the following morning. Now, as she watched from the shadow of the house, with the basin of antiseptic under her arm, the gambler's desperation rose stronger and stronger. She came out at length and walked steadily towards Black Bart. She had grown almost heedless of fear at this moment, but when she was within a pace, once more the head reared back, the teeth flashed, and the heart of Kate Cumberland, as always, stopped. Yet she did not retreat this time. All the color left her face, so that her eyes seemed amazingly blue and wide. One foot drew back, trembling, ready to spring to safety, yet she held her place. She moved, and it was towards Black Bart. At that came a snarl that would have made the heart of a lone grizzly quake and leave his new-found nuts. One further pace she made, and the beast plunged up and braced itself with its one strong foreleg. A devil of yellow-green gleamed in either eye, and past the grinning fangs she saw the hot, red throat, and she saw the flattened ears, the scars on the bony forehead, the muscles that bulged on the base of the jaw. Aye, strength to drive those knife-like teeth through flesh and bone at a single snap. More, she had seen their effect, and the throat of a bull calf cut
at a single slash. And yet she sank on her knees beside the monster. His head was well nigh as high as hers. Then, if he attacked, there could be no dream of escape for her, or she might drag herself away from the tearing teeth a disfigured horror forever. Think not that an iota of all these terrors missed her mind. No, she felt the fangs buried in her throat, and heard the snarl of the beast stifled with blood. Yet she laid her hand on the bandage across the shoulder of Black Bart. His head whirled. With those ears flattened, and with that long, lean neck, it was like the head of a striking snake. Her sleeve was rolled up to the elbow, and over the bare skin the teeth of the wolf dog were set. The snarl had grown so deep and hideous that the terror of it fairly shook her, and she saw that the jaws of the beast slavered with hunger. She knew 1,000 things about Black Bart, and among the rest that he had tasted human blood, and there is a legend which says that once a wild beast has tasted the blood of man, he will taste it a second time before he dies. She thought of that. She dared not turn her head lest she should encounter the hellfire of Bart's eyes. Yet she had passed all ordinary fear. She had reached the exquisite frenzy of terror when it becomes one with courage. The very arm over which the wolf's teeth were set moved, raised, and with both hands she untied the knot of the bandage. The snarling rose to a pitch of maniacal rage. The teeth compressed. If they broke the skin, it was the end. The first taste of blood would be enough, and drew away her arm. If she had started then, all the devil in the creature would be loosed, for her terror taught her that, and by some mysterious power that entered her at that moment, she was able to turn her head slowly and look deep into those terrible eyes. Her arm was released, but Black Bart crouched, and the snake-like head lowered. He was quivering throughout that steel-muscled body to throw himself at her throat. The finger was on the hair trigger. It needed a pressure not greater than a bodiless thought, and still she looked into the eyes of the wolf dog, and her terror had made her strangely light of body and dizzy of mind. Then the change came suddenly. The yellow-green changed, swirled in the eyes of Black Bart. The eyes themselves wavered, and at last looked away. The snarl dropped to a sullen growl, and Black Bart lay down as he had been before. His head was still turned toward her, to be sure, and the teeth were still bared, as with rapid, deft fingers she undid the bandage, and from instant to instant, as the bandage, in spite of her care, pressed against the wound, the beast shivered, and wicked glances flashed up at her face. The safe-blower who finds a soup cooling and dares not set it down felt as Kate Cumberland felt then. She never knew what kept her hands steady, but steady they were. The cloth was removed, and now she could see the red, angry wound, with the hair shaven away to a little distance on every side. She dipped her cloth into the antiseptic. It stung her fingers. She touched the cloth lightly against the wound, and to her astonishment the wolf dog relaxed every muscle and let his head fall to the ground. Also the growl died into a soft whine, and this in turn ended. She had conquered. Aye, when the wound was thoroughly cleansed, and when she started to wind the bandage again, she had even the courage to touch Black Bart's body and make him rise up so that she could pass the cloth freely. At her touch he shuddered, to be sure, as a man might shudder at the touch of an unclean thing, but there was no snarl, and the teeth were not bared. As she tied the knot which secured the bandage in its place, she was aware that the eyes of Bart, no longer yellow-green, watched her, and she felt some vague movement of the wonder that was passing through the brute mind. Then the head of the wolf-dog jerked up. He was staring at something in the distance,
and there was nothing under heaven that Bart would raise his head to look at in this manner, except one thing. The fingers of Kate grew stiff and trembled. Slowly, in a panic, she finished the knot, and then she was aware of someone who had approached without a sound and now stood behind her. She looked up at length before she rose to her feet. Thankfulness welled up warm in her heart to find her voice steady and commonplace when she said, "The wound is much better. Bart will be well in a very few days now." Whistling Dan did not answer, and his wondering eyes glanced past her own. She saw that he was staring at a double row of white indentations on her forearm, where the teeth of Black Bart had set. He knew those marks, and she knew he knew. Strength was leaving her, and weakness went through her, water where blood should have been. She dared not stay. In another moment she would be hopelessly in the grip of hysteria. So she rose and passed Dan without a word, and went slowly towards the house. She tried to hurry, indeed, but her legs would not quicken their pace. Yet at length she had reached shelter, and no sooner was she past the door of the house than her knees buckled. She had to steady herself with both hands as she dragged herself up the stairs to her room. There, from the window, she looked down and saw Whistling Dan standing as she had left him, staring blankly at the wolf dog. End of chapter 26.